Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. We're going to be taking a close look at this 2024 report from the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission. This one really focuses on where the U.S. China competition is going, particularly when it comes to emerging technologies.
Yeah, I mean, this report really kind of lays bare the anxieties in Washington about China's technological rise. And, it's suggesting some pretty bold steps for the U.S. to try to, maintain its leadership or in some cases maybe reclaim it.
Well, the report kind of starts with a bang right off the bat. They're calling for a quote-unquote Manhattan Project for Artificial General Intelligence, or AGI, and they want Congress to really put the pedal to the metal when it comes to resources for leading AI companies, even going as far as to give these companies a defense priorities and allocation system rating.
Right. And, most people probably just know that as the DX rating, and it's usually reserved for things that are considered, absolutely essential for national security. But what's interesting here is that they're not just talking about, making AI a little bit better. The goal here is AGI. And that means systems that could actually surpass human capabilities, across the board.
That's a pretty big goal. And the report does acknowledge that there are risks involved.
Yeah.
They're not just worried about, people losing their jobs or the economy being disrupted. They're talking about potentially losing control of these systems altogether.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of, that classic sci-fi problem, right? Like you create something that's smarter than you, and then you have to hope that you can somehow predict or control what it does. And the report doesn't try to downplay those concerns. But they also say that they think the benefits of getting AGI right outweigh the risks. They basically argue that if the U.S. wants to stay on top in the 21st century, it needs to win the AGI race, and they see it as a core national security issue.
It's really interesting how the report almost frames this technology race in almost existential terms.
Right. There's definitely this feeling of urgency. I mean, almost fear in the way they're talking about it. They're seeing China making a lot of progress in AI, and they're saying that the U.S. needs to really step up its game if it wants to stay ahead.
And it's not just AI. The report also focuses on Chinese influence in U.S. biotech. They recommend stricter oversight of Chinese involvement in research, data analysis, pharmaceutical development. Basically, they're saying, let's put some limits on collaboration in a field that's traditionally been very international.
Yeah, and that's a tough one to balance, right? Because on the one hand, you want to encourage open scientific exchange, but on the other hand, there are, real concerns about intellectual property theft, data security, and even national security risks.
The report kind of raises those concerns without necessarily providing concrete evidence of any actual wrongdoing. It seems like they're being extra cautious when it comes to Chinese involvement in an area that they see as, strategically important.
Yeah, and that's a theme that runs through the whole report. They're not just reacting to specific threats or incidents. They're trying to anticipate future risks and recommending proactive measures to deal with them.
So even if there isn't a smoking gun right now, they're saying, hey, let's not wait for one to appear before we do something.
Exactly. And that's where some of their recommendations get a little controversial, particularly when it comes to imports of certain Chinese technologies. They specifically call out things like autonomous humanoid robots and energy infrastructure products that can be controlled remotely.
So it's almost like they're drawing a line and saying, these technologies could be used for both civilian and military purposes, and we really need to be careful about who we allow to have them.
Right. I mean, the security concerns are pretty obvious.
Yeah.
You can imagine a situation where someone could hack into critical energy infrastructure and disrupt it, or even control it remotely. Or they could use autonomous robots for surveillance or even, sabotage.
It sounds like something out of a spy movie. But the report seems to be saying that policymakers are actually pretty worried about these kinds of scenarios.
Yeah, they are. And these worries go beyond just big infrastructure. They even talk about the everyday things that people buy online. For example, they look at Section 321 of the Tariff Act, which is often called the de minimis loophole. This rule basically says that goods under $800 can come into the U.S. without paying any duties and with very little inspection.
And that's a pretty big deal because so much of the stuff that people buy online, especially from places like Amazon or eBay, comes through this channel.
Right. And they're basically saying that this is a huge hole in U.S. customs enforcement. It lets in counterfeit products, things that aren't safe, and maybe even components that could be used for malicious purposes.
They even suggest that this loophole could be exploited for espionage, with hidden components being embedded in seemingly harmless products.
Yeah, they're painting a picture of a border that's really porous, not in the physical sense, but in the digital sense. There are just so many goods coming in that it's almost impossible to check everything effectively. And it's not just about, keeping dangerous things out. They also talk about how this loophole can hurt American businesses and workers, because when counterfeit goods or just, low quality products flood the market, it creates unfair competition.
So are they saying that Congress should just get rid of this de minimis rule entirely? I mean, that seems like it could have a pretty big impact on consumers, especially people who depend on those affordable imports.
Yeah, they do acknowledge that it could be disruptive, but they argue that the security and economic risks are just too big to ignore. They basically think it's a trade-off that the U.S. has to make.
It's interesting how they frame it in terms of national resilience.
Yeah.
We've become too reliant on cheap goods from China, and that makes us vulnerable.
It's definitely a call to, think about our consumption habits, maybe be willing to pay a little more for things that are made in countries with better labor and safety standards.
And they don't stop there. They also suggest changing the Consumer Product Safety Act to give the CPSC more power to issue mandatory recalls on Chinese products, even if the seller doesn't respond.
Right. It's a direct response to those cases where some Chinese companies have been really slow or just unwilling to fix safety problems that have been found in their products. It's about holding them accountable and, making sure that consumers are protected.
I guess the question is, how do you enforce that? I mean, can the CPSC U.S. agency really force a company that's operating in another country to do something?
And that's where the report's emphasis on working with allies comes in. They argue that if countries can agree on common standards and enforcement mechanisms, then they can put more pressure on companies that aren't playing by the rules.
So it's about leveling the playing field, not just in terms of trade, but also in terms of safety and accountability.
Yeah, exactly. And then they have another pretty interesting recommendation. They want online marketplaces to have to say who the manufacturer is for every product that's made in China. And they even want them to put a warning label on there about potential safety issues.
Wow. I mean, that would really change the online shopping experience. Can you imagine scrolling through Amazon and seeing a label that says, "Warning, this product may not meet U.S. safety standards"?
It's about giving consumers more information and maybe getting them to change their buying habits. But, there are also concerns about unintended consequences.
Could it lead to people just discriminating against all products that are made in China, even the ones that are perfectly safe?
Yeah, the report doesn't really address that, but it does highlight this growing tension between the convenience of online shopping and the desire for more transparency and accountability.
Okay, so moving beyond consumer goods, the report also talks about the whole issue of economic warfare. They actually suggest that the U.S. should consider using economic tools to pressure China. And they even go so far as to say that maybe the U.S. should revoke China's permanent normal trade relations status.
Yeah, and PNTR is basically what gives China the same trade benefits as any other U.S. ally, so revoking it would be a really big step. It would definitely send shockwaves through the global economy. It's like saying we're willing to use trade as a weapon in this rivalry.
What would that actually look like in practice? What would happen if PNTR was revoked?
Well, it would mean higher tariffs on Chinese goods, which could make them a lot less competitive in the U.S. market. It could also mess up supply chains and probably lead to higher prices for consumers. The idea is to basically hurt China economically and force them to change their behavior when it comes to things like stealing intellectual property, manipulating the market, and human rights abuses.
But couldn't that backfire? I mean, what if it ends up hurting American businesses and workers, or even starts a trade war?
The report does say that those are risks, but it seems like they think the potential benefits are worth it. It's a pretty big gamble.
And they're suggesting that Congress look at even more targeted economic measures, like getting rid of federal tax breaks for people who invest in Chinese companies that are on the entity list.
Right. The entity list is basically a list of companies that the Commerce Department has flagged because of security concerns. Things like companies that are developing advanced technologies that could be used for military purposes, or companies that have ties to the Chinese military.
So the idea is to use the tax code to discourage people from investing in companies that could be harmful to U.S. interests.
It's a way to use financial power to achieve strategic goals, and it makes you wonder, are we entering a new era of economic warfare where countries are going to use financial tools alongside the usual diplomatic and military ones?
I mean, the report seems to suggest that, yeah, this is the new reality of how great powers compete in the 21st century. It's a world where economics and technology are totally intertwined with national security, and the line between peace and conflict is getting blurrier all the time.
And in this new world, information is a key battleground. The report talks a lot about the need to keep an eye on things that aren't traditionally seen as military threats, but could signal that China is preparing for conflict.
Things that wouldn't normally be seen as military threats.
Right. They're talking about things like stockpiling, energy shifting production from civilian to military industries, even subtle changes in the types and locations of strategic reserves.
So they're looking for clues not just on the battlefield, but in factories, warehouses, shipping lanes.
It's a much more nuanced and holistic view of national security. They argue that the old way of gathering intelligence, which was mostly focused on military assets, isn't enough anymore.
So they're basically saying that we need to significantly upgrade our intelligence capabilities to track these unconventional indicators. They even suggest creating an energy strategic warning system,
which would involve a lot of cooperation between agencies like the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the Departments of Energy, Commerce, State, and the Treasury.
It's like recognizing that economic and technological trends can be just as important as troop movements when you're trying to figure out what your rival is planning.
And understanding those plans requires more than just collecting and analyzing data. You need human judgment, intuition, the ability to connect the dots.
It's about seeing the big picture and anticipating threats before they actually happen.
Exactly. And that's another reason why the report stresses the importance of working with allies. They're not just talking about sharing intelligence or doing joint military exercises. They're calling for a united front to control the flow of critical technologies to China and counter its growing military power.
They're acknowledging that the U.S. can't win this rivalry on its own. They need partners who share their concerns and are willing to work together to address them.
But building and maintaining strong alliances is tough. Different countries have different interests and
And
priorities.
China is really good at exploiting those differences, using economic and diplomatic leverage to weaken alliances and create divisions.
It's a tricky balancing act. The U.S. has to be firm in its commitment to countering China's aggressive actions, but also flexible enough to take into account the concerns of its allies.
The report doesn't offer any easy answers. It just highlights how important it is to have a coordinated and strategic approach, one that recognizes how complex this rivalry is and how long-term the challenge is going to be.
It's a call for patience, persistence, and a willingness to adapt to a world that's changing really fast.
It's not just about, managing alliances in general either. The report actually gets into some really specific geopolitical hotspots, especially when it comes to Taiwan.
Yeah. They recommend changing the Arms Export Control Act to basically put Taiwan on the same level as NATO allies when it comes to getting U.S. military equipment. It's a pretty clear message that the U.S. is taking Taiwan's security very seriously and is ready to give them what they need to defend themselves.
That's a pretty big policy shift, and it's definitely going to get a reaction from Beijing. They see Taiwan as a breakaway province that needs to be reunified with the mainland eventually.
It's a tough balancing act, for sure. The U.S. wants to stop China from being aggressive, but without starting a war. And it's not just about military deterrence either. The report suggests setting up a Taiwan Allies Fund to encourage other countries to keep their formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan.
That's interesting, using financial incentives to counter China's attempts to isolate Taiwan internationally.
It shows that they recognize that diplomacy and economics can be just as powerful as military force in this kind of competition. And the report doesn't shy away from criticizing China's human rights record either, especially in Hong Kong. They recommend investigating whether Hong Kong should be labeled as a major money laundering hub because of its alleged role in helping people get around sanctions, particularly those involving Russia and Iran.
Wow, that's a serious accusation. It reflects the growing concerns about how Hong Kong's autonomy is being eroded and how it's becoming more integrated into mainland China's financial system.
The report says that Hong Kong is being used more and more as a channel for illegal financial activity, and they want more scrutiny of financial institutions operating there, especially their ability to stop transactions that violate U.S. sanctions.
It's a reminder of the challenges that open societies face in a world where authoritarian powers are becoming more assertive.
Yeah, and it underscores the need to be vigilant, not just in terms of military preparedness, but also when it comes to economic and financial security. This 2024 report from the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission really paints a complex and sometimes worrisome picture of the rivalry between the U.S. and China.
It's a call to action, a guide for navigating the challenges and opportunities of a world that's increasingly shaped by this competition. It reminds us that we're all involved in this global game, whether we know it or not. Our choices as consumers, as investors, as citizens, they all have real consequences. The future isn't just something that happens to us. We actually shape it.
This report gives us a glimpse into that future, a future where technology and economics are deeply connected to national security, where the lines between peace and conflict are getting blurrier and blurrier. It's a future that demands our attention, our engagement, and our informed participation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into this important report, we hope you've gained a better understanding of the forces shaping our world and the choices we face. It's up to each of us to decide what role we want to play in this unfolding story. Thanks for joining us.